Steve Bannon is joining us now. He served as a naval officer just after the Vietnam War on U.S. destroyers. His warships cruised the South China Sea, Western Pacific, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, hunting for Soviet nuclear fast attack subs. Now, 40 years later, Bannon's back at sea, right now, this time on an unnamed privateer frigate sailing off the U.S. coast, but his mission remains the same: advance the cause of freedom, choked off by an authoritarian regime bent on global domination through force and intimidation. That's China, and he's broke through their firewall. Steve, thanks for being with us today, sir.
Thanks. We're not quite a frigate, but we definitely are a privateer. But we're off the coast of New England right now. Been out here for about a week. Was at the New York Harbor last week at the Statue of Liberty. But it's been a great experience. Takes me back to my youth in the Navy. But thanks for having me, John. John. And listen, I just want to say something about the show, and to thank America's Voice, to thank you and the people at the John Fredericks Radio Network. The show's become huge globally. It's listened to tens of millions of times. We get incredible feedback. So it's through the good offices of the John Fredericks Radio Network we're able to put this together. And as you saw, Jason Miller, our co-host since October, just bounced over to the Trump campaign as a senior strategist. So I think we're having a little bit of impact.
I would say so, Steve. But look, you have broke in to the mainland China firewall. Your shows are now broadcast into Shanghai, into mainland China. I don't know how you've done that. I'm not going to ask on air publicly because I don't want them to figure it out. But you're the voice of freedom, and you're now China's public enemy number one. The Chinese Communist Party official Twitter has tweeted about you. You get blasted every night on CCT, their nightly news. How has Steve Bannon become China Communist Party enemy number one?
Well, it's interesting. The People's Daily, which is the New York Times of the regime, actually published a cartoon this morning. I haven't had a chance to get to you, John.
I saw it.
But it's got three Americans: Mike Pompeo, Peter Navarro, and Steve Bannon, who are we're blowing up a balloon. Basically, it's the USA's problems. They say we're blaming everything on China. Listen, the freedom of the Chinese people is going to be the great, moving, and most important event of the first half of the 21st century. It's inextricably linked with our freedom. All the Chinese freedom fighters that I deal with every day sit here and tell me, they say, look, what's happening in the United States right now is neo-Maoism. This is exactly the cultural revolution of the 60s. What we say was the hippie movement and what happened in the anti-war movement. That was very much an anti-war movement in a civil rights movement, but it didn't take the level of neo-Maoism. And this is what you're seeing right now. It's very different in tone and texture than what happened in the 60s. This is what the Red Guards did in China, and this is a direct, it's directly linked back to the French Revolution. People in the Richmond area should know this. Last night, Christopher Columbus, that famous and beautiful statue right there at the foot of the boulevard by the tennis courts, where Arthur Ashe and so many young people learned to play tennis. Was torn down and thrown into the lake last night. In England, they're going after Cecil Rhodes. They went after Gladstone yesterday. The day before, people haven't listened to the show. They went after Churchill statue, Gandhi statue, and Abraham Lincoln's beautiful statue right across from Parliament. So this is the Red Guard. It's a cultural revolution that we're going through, and the Chinese people understand the CCP's in back of a lot of this. Yesterday I said on the show, on the day of Mr. Floyd's funeral in Houston, Mr. Floyd was murdered obviously in cold blood by the former police officer and his colleagues. But if you go back and look at Mr. Floyd's life, at the time that he died, he had the coronavirus. He was sick with the coronavirus, which came directly from the CCP. And now we know from Norwegian intelligence and MI6, it definitely came from a lab, they're saying, and it probably came in maybe even in the early fall of 2019 when they had plenty of time to stop it. So that's number one. Number two, Mr. Floyd had fentanyl in his system. Fentanyl is just the drug that the Chinese Communist Party, in league with the Mexican cartels, are blowing up through Middle America and particularly into the upper Midwest. Mr. Floyd had fentanyl in the system. Mr. Floyd also didn't have access to a great manufacturing job, and the reason all those jobs have been stripped out by Wall Street and sent to the Chinese Communist Party in China. And last, Mr. Floyd was actually called. They called the police about, was he? We don't know the facts. Was he passing a fake $20 bill or whatever? It's the Chinese Communist Party at the Canadian border in January. It's publicly reported there was a train stopped, and they had $900,000, I think, in ones of fake currency, of counterfeit currency. It's known that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to flood the world with fake U.S. dollars to try to break the U.S. dollar. And so the Chinese Communist Party is the enemy of the Chinese people. They're the enemy of the American people, the enemy of humankind. And to me, this is the great struggle. And it shocks me that we're in a situation in early June of 2020 where 110,000 of our fellow Americans are dead, and we're still losing almost 1,000 people a day. They're talking about the coronavirus coming back in another wave, or even this first wave hasn't petered out. They're talking about increases in that. And yet there's no discussion on mainstream media. There's no real discussion about holding China accountable, the Chinese Communist Party, yet we're at each other's throats. And I think that we got to pivot to what the real enemy is here and the real problem. And people have really got to focus on this, quickly, because the Chinese Communist Party are, as President Trump would say, tough hombres.
Well, one of the things you said in your interview with the Straits, you said one of the reasons for the move in Hong Kong, you said, is that I think they're prepared to stand up to the West right now. The key phrase was right now, take advantage of the moment, and say, we don't need you, we don't need your capital, we don't need your technology. And so you also said that the Chinese on the mainland, the CCP, they can't be allowed to see successes in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, of democracy, of economic growth, because the juxtaposition of mainland China is too stark. Explain that.
Yeah. Step back for a second. This is why it's so important. And if you don't think this is affecting your everyday life, this is the most important thing in the world affecting your everyday life, your job, your savings, even the mortgage on your house, right, and the future of your kids. The Chinese Communist Party realizes right now that, and they've essentially decoupled. They say, President Trump's the fault, President Trump. They essentially, in May of 2019, made a decision to decouple from us technologically. They have their own technical specifications so that ZTE and Huawei and other companies can never be held hostage by the West. So they made this fundamental decision. At the same time, they walked away, as you remember, from President Trump's deal. What they can't allow to have happen as they decouple from the West is to have any examples of where democracy and access to information, the Chinese people are successful, and particularly with English common law. That's in Taiwan, it's in Hong Kong, it's in Singapore, and quite frankly, in Europe, London, and the United States. Everybody knows Chinese people come in when they have access to English common law. They're hardworking, they're smart, they put their heads down, they're law-abiding, they're successful, and they're very family-oriented. The CCP can't allow that, and that's why you're seeing Hong Kong today is just like Austria in 1938. It's the place where the dictatorship is going to test the West and see if it's got a soft underbelly. And what they're doing in Hong Kong, they made a deal for 50 years. There was going to be, one country, two systems. The people in Hong Kong were going to have religious freedom, democracy. It's the most important deal the CCP ever signed because it's not about trade, it's not about arms, it's not about war, it's about human beings. These people were all protected by the British Empire. And essentially we transferred them to the Chinese Communist Party. We now know the CCP will lie about everything. The hammer that's getting dropped on Hong Kong is brutal. And here's the point. And I think this is why these protesters, these young kids in Hong Kong, many of whom are Christians, right, have really done for the world. They've stripped the mask off the CCP. Right now, I don't think they care if we cut them off with access to capital or access to technology, which I think we must do to choke them down. They're prepared to make the bet that they're going to control the Eurasian landmass with Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Control that, and then pivot to become a global hegemon 10 years from now. That's why they must be confronted, and they must be stopped in Hong Kong. Pompeo today came out, Mike Pompeo, and eviscerated Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, a publicly traded bank, and huge footings in the United States, who've essentially sided with the CCP against the people in Hong Kong. What's happening in China right now, what's happening in Hong Kong right now, what's happening in the South China Sea right now is exactly what happened in Europe in the late 1930s. We're either going to confront this now, take the CCP on, allow the Chinese people to overthrow them, or we're going to slide to a much broader and I think more difficult conflict in the years ahead.
Steve, let me ask you this. Let's get to the 1930s. I know you're a student of history. At what was the touch point in history that Europe and the West should have stood up? Like when?
You say Hitler. You start Hitler with the Rhineland, and then Austria and Czech. Actually, 1938 Czechoslovakia, not Austria. You see this point where they just continue to expand. They continue to take territory, and they continue to put people under their dictatorship. And the West would always blink. Remember, in 1938, it was Neville Chamberlain that went over there and negotiated. He came back to England. He was a hero. It was peace in our time. He had a deal with Hitler, and Hitler, on September 1st, 1939, a little over a year later, invaded Poland, and that triggered the beginning of the Second World War. The kinetic part of it. That's what we're doing here. What they're testing us in Hong Kong. If we don't stand up to them there, Taiwan is going to be next on the agenda. And then what they're going to do is blockade the South China Sea, which they've already militarized under Joe Biden's watch. I mean, we have, and I will be spending the entire summer making sure the American people understand that we're in this jam because of one guy, Joe Biden. President Obama understood American foreign policy had to have this thing called the pivot to Asia. We had to stop being so Middle East centric. Right, with these wars in the Middle East, we had to worry about what the existential threat was. That was China. He deputized Joe Biden. Remember, the whole reason Biden was his vice president is the Wall Street faction of the Democratic Party thought Obama was too young and naive on foreign policy. He ran as a populist, anti-war Democrat. That's how he beat Hillary Clinton in Iowa and these other places. So they wanted to put an experienced guy. Biden had been, essentially chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades. He had been involved in all these terrible trade deals. He had been involved in all this debacle. He's a true globalist, right? He represents Wilmington, Delaware, which is the corporate headquarters of all the global corporations in America. And he was the guy put in charge. He was the point man with Xi when Xi became president of China. It was Biden that was designated to be, when Xi was vice president and when Xi became president, to be the point man to negotiate, particularly two central factors, which was cyber intrusions and stealing of intellectual property by the Chinese and the militarization of the South China Sea. Obama and people understood in the Republican time that were the triggers to war. Unless we stop the Chinese from these cyber intrusions, remember, they steal $600 billion a year of intellectual property from U.S. companies. Let me repeat that: $600 billion a year. The Commerce Department has a study that says it's been like $3 trillion of intellectual property transfer, and everybody in your audience that works for a tech company understands what I'm talking about. They've essentially stolen that. So Biden was put in charge of stopping that and making sure that we had a demilitarization of the South China Sea, where the Chinese have built these artificial islands, which are essentially aircraft carriers. They're landing fields. They're like little midways or wake islands, if you remember back to World War II, in the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is the choke point through the Malacca Straits that cuts off Korea and cuts off Japan from world trade. And so what China's going to do, if not stopped in Hong Kong, Taiwan's next, then they're going to shut down the South China Sea. Korea, Japan will fall. The United States will be pushed out of the Western Pacific and Asia. And this will be an Asian century. China will become a hegemon in Asia and then a global hegemon. And the United States will become a tributary state. We're virtually a tributary state economically right now. What I mean by that is we send them natural resources. We send them pigs. Smithfield Hams in Southern Virginia was bought by the Chinese. We send them hams and we send them pork and beef and soybeans. We send lots of natural gas and raw materials, timber, all of that. We send very little product. That's why President Trump negotiated this trade deal, because the difference in high value added manufacturing, they've stolen and taken all the factories to China. It's the reason people like Mr. Floyd don't have access to high value added manufacturing jobs where you can basically have a family and have a career. This all inextricably linked, but the Chinese Communist Party with Wall Street, the global corporations have deindustrialized the United States, and we're paying the price for this. This is why Trump was president. It's the managed decline. If you cut the TV on every night and watch the late news in Richmond or throughout Virginia, you see statues coming down, you see all this happening. This is managed decline. This is why I'm saying people have to embrace. Don't look away. You must look at it. This is managed decline of the United States of America. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. And if you want to reverse that, the central thing we have to do is to confront our true enemy, the existential threat, which is the Chinese Communist Party, the last totalitarian dictatorship of the 20th century. It's the unfinished work of the 20th century. We must confront that. And believe me, they're going whole hog on digital, on social media, to throw gasoline or really kerosene on the fire here in the United States. Every day in their media, they're laughing that the United States is in decline, the United States is at each other's throats, the United States is imploding, and they're sitting there laughing as they keep the boot on the neck of the Chinese people, basically the slave labor of the Chinese people. And so this is, I think, and if we don't stop them economically, if we don't cut them off from capital, if we don't cut them off from technology, we're going to slide into a kinetic war in the next 3 or 4 years. Look, I predicted this on my show, I think in 2015 or early 16, talking about the South China Sea, that if we didn't confront the CCP, that within 5-6 years, we'd be at a shooting war with them in the South China Sea. So people in Norfolk, Virginia, the people in the fleet, Atlantic Fleet, know exactly what I'm talking about, and this has got to be confronted, and it needs to be confronted now. If we blink now, it's going to be very dark horizons for us.
Stephen K. Bannon, we're almost out of time. I know you're busy. Just define specifically confronting the CCP now. What does that look like?
Starting off right now, there's about $3 trillion they trade in the United States. We must stop. We must deregister all the companies, the Chinese companies that have CCP influence. Basically, all of them must be delisted. You're seeing this now in legislation. Number one, cut them off from all capital in the United States. That means delist all their companies, deregister their companies, cut them off from the bond market. They have $1 trillion of basically sovereign debt from the 1920s that deplorables own. You know, Jonah Bianco and that group, the American Bondholders Foundation, there's almost $1 trillion of bonds that the United States, basically people, when China was a free republic, we underwrote this back in the 20s. They stopped paying it in the 30s when the Japanese invaded. They owe us $1 trillion. They have to pay back that debt to the American people. We have to cut them off from capital markets, have to deregister the companies. They have no access to Western capital, which is essentially the deplorables' money. It's the pension fund money. That's got to be stopped 100%. Number two, they can have no access to American technology, no access to American technology at all. They got to be cut off. There can't be any forced technology transfers, but more importantly, there can't be any partnerships to build the firewall. The firewall must come down. We must take the firewall down. Every American company involved in, whether it's Cisco, Microsoft, wherever it is, has to walk away from involvement with the Chinese Communist Party today. We must enforce it. If we do that, if we cut them off today from American capital, and if we cut them off from American technology, we have the opportunity to have the Chinese people overthrow them, and that's how it has to happen. We can't do this, okay? It has to be the Chinese people. It's one of the reasons I've dedicated so much of my life to working on this, because it's so, to me, urgent for the United States, the West, and the Chinese people that this happen, this dictatorship comes down. But if you want to see this every day, we talk about it on the show. We've got it up on the War Room website. We do specials every Saturday. John, thanks so much to you and your team. But I will tell you, you're having a major impact. There was basically a government in exile, the new federal state of China, by expatriate cultural figures, sports figures, businessmen, tens of thousands throughout the world, really millions, have announced that their focus is to take down the CCP. So you have many comrades in arms here.
Okay. Also, I just want to tell our audience that there is a Bannon special on the wall that we think will be going on, I think 10 noon to 4. Steve, I think you guys are working on that.
Thursday.
On Thursday. Must-listen radio.
Yeah. It's the one year anniversary of the wall we built down in El Paso, straight up the hill. We're going to have a 1 hour, I think right now, Charlie Kirk, other real amazing voices on the right are going to be on there. Talk about the wall, immigration. We can't lose sight of that. That's a central thing for this pandemic and all of it. It's going to be in the afternoon of Thursday. We'll get more details to you this afternoon.
Okay, we're looking forward to that. Steve, I know you have to go, but I just got to ask this final question. The president yesterday saying he's pulling out a third to a half our troops out of Germany. He says, look, we've been there long enough. Let's get them home. Your reaction?
I think, listen, what we have to do is focus on the existential threat that is China. Russia right now is not a threat to roll across the North German plain and attack Germany. Heck, Germany's their business partner. So we need, I think, troops in these places forward deployed. It's smart. I think it's reorganizing them, etc. We need to focus on Asia. We need to focus on Asia. We need to focus on Asia. President Trump has got a grandmaster strategic plan here. He's the first guy to confront the Chinese Communist Party as an existential threat. What he's doing is smart, and you're seeing the old guard, right? The old guard that want things to be what they are with this huge defense budget we have and spread it over everywhere. President Trump's trying to concentrate on where the real enemy is. So I wholeheartedly support this, and you're going to hear nothing but the establishment all week saying how Trump, Colin Powell, remember, look at their track record. Everybody's criticizing President Trump. Just look at the mess that they left the United States in. Look at the $10 trillion that we just pissed away. Look at all the deaths. Look at all the destruction on their watch with their recommendations. Remember when they sold you on phony wars? Remember, when they were in power, what they did. Mm-hmm. Every one of those guys' recommendations have been terrible, and I'm not questioning their patriotism, their valor, their courage. They're solid, strong Americans, but they just have poor judgment, and their judgment has historically been wrong. That's what President Trump's turning around.
All right, Stephen K. Bannon with us on a privateer frigate in the Atlantic Ocean, and I was thinking about you, Steve, when the sun came up. I'm like, all right, Steve Bannon's on this ship out in the Atlantic Ocean, so off the coast of New England. Sun comes up. He's got a cup of coffee, getting ready for the day. Remind you when you were on that. You were on what? People don't realize you were on one of the best ships ever, right? What was that?
The USS Paul F. Foster was a Spruance class. Guys in Norfolk, the Naval say we were actually the first ship of the class because the Spruance had problems out of the yard at Pascagoula. We were the Pacific Fleet. We were ASW Ship of the Year in 1978. It was a great crew. It was a great ship. It was, our mission was to plane guard the carrier battle groups and really to hunt for fast attack Soviet submarines to keep them away from aircraft carriers. And it was best years of my life. And I've had a great time. You're right. This morning at 5 o'clock, I was up, had my cup of coffee, and watched the sun come up over the Atlantic. It's amazing. I may not come back. If this thing works out, that we can keep broadcasting here, I may be gone forever.
I was thinking about you at 5. I said he's up right now, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, having a cup of coffee at 5:05 a.m. Stephen K. Bannon, thank you for being with us.